One of the great proofs that the Bible is true is that it doesn't sugarcoat the lives of the great heroes of the faith. Bible characters are presented warts and all. And boys and girls, have you ever heard that phrase, warts and all? There's a man called Oliver Cromwell who ruled over England once upon a time, and he was having his picture painted, and it said that he asked the person drawing the picture not to make him look better than he was, but to paint him warts and all, to paint a realistic picture. And that's what we have in the Bible. We have it with Abraham. He's one of the most significant Bible characters. It would be hard to overestimate how significant Abraham is. And he's certainly presented in the Bible as a man of faith. But he's also a man who is deeply flawed, just like us. Here's a man who has just completed an 800-mile journey in obedience to the call of God to go out into the unknown. And when he gets to the promised land, he demonstrates his faith by worshipping the one true God in face of all the idol worship around him. He builds altars in the faith that one day God will give this land to his descendants as God has promised. But in the second half of this chapter, he meets his first real test of faith. And the spiritual high point of the first half of the chapter is followed by the outbreak of famine. And this is often the way. Great spiritual highs are immediately followed often by strong temptations. We might assume that if we're in a spiritual high, then we'll not have to worry about testing or temptation for a while. But that's not the way it is it? As we saw this morning, when did one of Jesus' most intense periods of temptation come? It came immediately after he'd been baptized, and a voice from heaven had said, "This is my beloved Son." And now, right after Abraham has shown such great faith in moving to the promised land, things almost completely fall apart. A famine strikes. And you can imagine some of the questions racing around in his head. God, this is the land that you've promised to give to my descendants, but if I stay here any longer, I'll starve to death. I've moved here because of your promise to make a great nation out of me and give this land to my descendants, but there's not enough food to even sustain me. And you can imagine the local people scoffing at him. Your altars aren't doing you much good now, Abraham. Where's your God now? Martin Luther, in his usual blunt way, says that to the eye of human reason, it often looks like God's power is weak and stupid. Abraham has stepped out in faith, and he goes headfirst into famine. And so as we go through this chapter, we will be critical of Abraham. I think we have to be critical of Abraham, but let's not underestimate how bleak the situation looked. It looked as if he had given up everything for a God who couldn't even look after him. It looked as though he had given up everything for a God who couldn't even look after him. And some of God's people give up so much to become Christians. Maybe all their family are against it, but they say, no, I'm going to believe in Jesus. I'm going to stake everything on him. And then almost immediately, it seems that things start going wrong. And in this bleak situation, Abraham makes two decisions. The first is to leave the promised land and go down to Egypt to try and find food there. And then the second decision is to try and deceive the Egyptians when he actually gets there. The rights and wrongs of the first decision are debatable, but the second decision is clearly wrong. The first decision is to go down to Egypt. And it's hard to read that without thinking ahead to God's words to Abraham's son Isaac at the start of chapter 26, when there's also famine in the land. Do not go down to Egypt. It's true that a generation later God would appear to Abraham's grandson Jacob, again at a time of famine, and say, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. But in that case, God is giving him authorization to go, to leave the promised land. And Abraham doesn't have that here. But maybe he had no other choice. Verse 10 does emphasize how severe the famine was, and perhaps suggests that Abraham had no option. Though at the same time, we don't read of Abraham seeking God's will. God is absent from the whole passage till we get down to verse 17. The emphasis is on Abraham trying to get himself out of a difficult situation by human effort. God doesn't seem to be much of a consideration for Abraham as famine hits. So going to Egypt, it was the natural choice, but it wasn't necessarily a wise one. But having made that decision to go to Egypt, Abraham then feels he has to make a second decision. And that is in relation to his wife, who he now has to protect from the interest she might attract there. And so while we perhaps can't be dogmatic and say that the first decision was definitely wrong, it is true that one sinful, or at least unwise decision in our lives will almost invariably lead to more, but for the grace of God. If you compromise on one thing, it can easily lead to further compromises. Perhaps someone goes out for the night to the type of place a Christian really shouldn't be, but having made that first compromise, that they're more likely to make more before the night is out. Or think of a believer who starts a relationship with an unbeliever. That immediately means that there will be things in the relationship that the unbeliever is okay with, but the believer isn't. But because the believer has entered into that relationship when they shouldn't, then they've put themselves in a position where they'll be under pressure to make further compromises. So whatever the rights and wrongs of Abraham going to Egypt, as soon as he makes a decision, and before he even gets there, he hatches a plan that's all about self-preservation. Now, it might be possible to put a positive spin on this and say that Abraham was concerned about his own survival, because if he was killed, then God's promise couldn't be fulfilled. And yet, as we've seen, these verses aren't exactly ringing out with Abraham's concern for God's plan. And so he tells Sarai to lie and say she's his sister, so the Egyptians won't kill him in order to take her. What is Abraham acting out of? Well, he's acting in fear, not faith. He's taking things into his own hands. It's not that he's unaware of God's promises, but he's not willing to act on them. And that's the big problem in these verses. That's the root problem. It's not the deception. Of course, that is wrong. But the big problem is the lack of faith, which leads to the deception. The big problem is Abraham thinking, right, God's not going to come through for me. I'm going to have to take this into my own hands. I'm sure if we had been able to interrupt the story and said, well, Abraham, do you believe God's promises? He would have said, well, of course I do. Don't you see that I've traveled 800 miles because of God's promise? But at the same time, he at least thinks God needs a helping hand. To put it the way we thought of this morning, he's taking a sinful shortcut. Intellectually, in his head, he may believe God's promises, but practically he just can't see how they're going to be fulfilled. And so he takes matters into his own hands. He acts in fear rather than faith. And we can often do the same. It's one thing to believe that God will provide all that we need, but it might be another thing if we ever find ourselves in the position where we could lose our job for refusing to go along with some new equality legislation. How many Christians are there whose fear of being alone has been stronger than their faith in God's word, and they've married an unbeliever? It's one thing to believe God's promises about the growth of the church, or at least to believe them in theory, but if the community around seems so hard, if our evangelism seems to bear little fruit, it's easy to respond in fear, pull up the drawbridge and focus on self-preservation rather than reaching out. Or as we thought about this morning, there's a temptation for church leaders not to say things because they fear people will react badly and leave. The whole problem with Abraham's approach is that it's human scheming which leaves God out of the picture. And that's an approach which is guaranteed to end in disaster. So what is Abraham's scheme? Well, he tells Sarah to tell the Egyptians that she's his sister rather than his wife, which was actually a half-truth. Chapter 20, verse 12 tells us that she was actually his half-sister. But the fact that there's an element of truth to it is no excuse. It was intended to deceive the Egyptians, and it did exactly that. But what was the advantage of it? Well, Abraham thought that if someone took a shine to Sarai, then they would just kill him to get the husband out of the way. Maybe he hoped that if someone wanted to marry her and thought that he was her brother, they would come to him first to negotiate, and that would buy him some time to think of a way out. Well, as it turns out, Abraham is right that the Egyptians will find Sarai attractive, but then something happens that he didn't foresee. And that is that Pharaoh finds out that there's a beautiful and available woman in town. And pharaohs don't have to tend to negotiate with brothers-in-law, and so he takes her just like that. And financially, Abraham does well out of it. In verse 16, Pharaoh gives him sheep, oxen, donkeys, camels, servants. But I doubt it's much of a consolation if your wife is living with another man. And so all Abraham's scheming has backfired. He was right about some of the consequences of what might happen, but he couldn't foresee it all because he's not God, and neither are we. Often we may have a fairly good idea of what the immediate consequences of our action will be. We can see the inevitable job loss or relationship breakup or the person leaving the church. And those things look like disasters. And yet what we can't see is the good that will come from our faithfulness. Nor can we see the disastrous consequences which might come further down the road from our decision to take the faithless option today. Of course, for Abraham, the one who suffers most from his unfaithfulness isn't actually him, it's his wife. And that's so often the way. Our unfaithfulness hurts those around us, often the very ones we're trying to protect. It's never just us who are hurt by our unfaithfulness. And maybe we'll never even realize who it was who was watching us when we had the opportunity to respond in faith but didn't. But we chose to act in fear instead and act out of human wisdom. We can cause brothers and sisters in Christ to stumble without even realizing we've done it. We can put people off the gospel and not know it. And so at the end of verse 16, we've been painted an absolutely gloomy picture of one bad choice leading to another. Abraham, by his faithlessness, has got himself into a situation where it seems that there's no way out. And worse than even the consequences that his actions have brought on himself and on his wife, he's put God's whole plan at risk, at least humanly speaking. Because what does the plan depend on? It depends on Abraham and Sarah having a son. And eventually it will depend on Jesus being born from that family line. But now if Sarah does get pregnant, the boy is going to be seen as a son of Pharaoh. Not a son of promise. What an absolute mess. And maybe you're thinking, well, what a depressing sermon. But we need to feel this. This is where human scheming gets us. This is where human wisdom ends up. This is what happens when we respond in fear rather than faith. And yet, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. In light of this dark background, what a ray of light we have in verse 17. But the Lord. There has not been one mention of God in this whole section. It's as if everything is dependent on Abraham's scheming. And yet when Abraham hits rock bottom, God intervenes. Even though he's been ignored, God has been there the whole time. And now that Abraham has reached the end of himself, he's run out of schemes, now that he's totally blown it, the Lord intervenes. And I think it's particularly encouraging because verse 17 doesn't start by saying that Abraham came to his senses. Because even if he had come to his senses, what could he have done? He can't very well go into Pharaoh and say, well, actually, your new wife has been married to me all along. Can I have her back, please? Abraham hits rock bottom, but he finds that God is there with him. Abraham had forgotten God, but God hadn't forgotten Abraham. Abraham had forgotten God, but God hadn't forgotten Abraham. I like the way someone has summed up this story. The point of the story of Abraham in Egypt is simply that God's plan and promises will come to pass, even though humans are sinful and weak. So if you want a one-line summary of the sermon to remember, that is it. God's plan and purposes will come to pass, even though humans are sinful and weak. There is no moral to the story in a traditional sense. Yes, we can see how Abraham got into this mess and learn from him. And yet we've all done the same. We have all responded to situations in fear rather than faith. And so the story is here to tell us that both our lives and the future of the church are just doomed unless God intervenes. And that's the gospel. Our lives are doomed for eternity unless God intervenes, unless the God that we have ignored the whole time steps out of the shadows and does something. And in Jesus Christ, that's exactly what he's done. Sometimes reading about the flaws of Bible characters could be reassuring in the wrong way. We can say, well, they were human just like us, and stop there. And yes, they were human just like us, but that's not an excuse. Rather, it means that we are completely doomed unless God intervenes. Even a great hero of the faith like Abraham had to look outside of himself to find salvation. And so do we. And if we'll do that, if we'll look outside of ourselves for salvation, it's at this point the passage becomes reassuring. Have you blown it in your own Christian walk? Did you start well, only to make one compromise after another? Have you sinned in ways that have affected others? Abraham had done all those things, but God wasn't finished with him yet. And he's not finished with you either if you're his child. God doesn't go back to the drawing board here and call someone else to go to the promised land and become the father of a new nation. Why not? Why not just get someone else when Abraham had failed him so badly? Well, because God had bound himself to Abraham. He'd made promises to him, and in Jesus Christ, God has bound himself to us. And we should take encouragement here, not just on an individual level, but for the church. Why will the Church of Jesus Christ keep going from generation to generation? Not because of our ingenuity, not even because of our faithfulness, but because God has promised, and he will see to it. If tonight has brought to your conscience areas where, like Abraham, you have acted in fear rather than faith, what are you to do? How is God calling you to respond? Well, like Abraham, he's calling you to respond humbly. It's not pleasant to be brought face to face with how we failed, and it's the most natural thing in the world to make excuses. You don't know what it was like. You don't know the pressure I was under. Abraham could have said to Pharaoh, what else could I have done? But he doesn't argue back. He says nothing. He humbly accepts the rebuke of a pagan king. How slow we are to accept correction and rebuke, even from our friends or from church leaders who care about us. Never mind from our enemies. Never mind from people who worship a different God like Pharaoh did. And yet there are occasions like this in the Bible where believers are rebuked by unbelievers. One of the other times is Jonah trying to flee from God, and he's rebuked by the pagan sailors. What is this that you have done? Which is almost exactly the same words as here in verse 18 that Pharaoh says, what is this that you have done to me? And the old Scottish preacher Hugh Martin has a section in his commentary on Jonah entitled The World Rebuking the Church. The world rebuking the church. Do we have any concept of that? Just because someone's not a Christian doesn't mean they can't be right about an issue and the Christian be in the wrong. But by God's grace, Abraham doesn't protest. He responds in humility. He gets up, he takes his wife, he heads back to the place God has called him to be. Abraham doesn't respond in pride, but neither does he respond in despair. And Satan loves to get us in one of these two places, either pride or despair, because both of them will keep us from coming to God. God has opened up an escape route, and Abraham doesn't stay in his sin, lamenting the fact that he blew it. He's not going to let it define him for the rest of his life. Have you fallen badly, publicly? Has one compromise led to another and to another, to the point where you don't even know where you are anymore? Well, get up and go back to God by His grace. And don't worry about the consequences, because that's what got Abraham into this mess in the first place. Leave the consequences to God. By His grace, turn around and go back to the place He has called you to be. That's what Abraham does, verses 3 and 4 of chapter 13. And he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. As he did, he would have had much to confess, but he goes back to where it all began. As someone has entitled these verses, God keeps hold of losers. God keeps hold of losers. And that's us. We don't have to pretend that we're anything different. But if we have ever truly believed in Him, then He won't let go of us. And no matter how hard or long the journey will be back to the place where He's called us to be, we can be sure that He will be with us. Don't let your failures define you, but get up, repair your altar, and call on the name of the Lord. The New Testament tells us if we are faithless, He remains faithful. If we are faithless, He remains faithful. God keeps hold of losers, and that gives us all hope. Amen. Well, let's praise the God who keeps hold of losers from Psalm 73. Psalm 73C, page 161, and the tune is Trust 270. What will enable us to keep going in the Christian life? Is it because we're faithful? No, it's because He holds us in the second line there by our right hand. And yet, at the same time, verse 3, if God is really holding on to us, then that will be seen in whether we are content to live far from Him and stay far from Him, or whether we draw near to Him. The true believer may wander for a while, but by God's grace, they will come back, because He will draw them back to Him. So Psalm 73C, page 161, tune 270, we'll stand to sing praise.